It's been 8 months since President Bola Ahmed Tinubu took over as the new chairman of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Tonight, let's speak with the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Strategic Communications, Linda Akibe, who joins us from our Abuja studios. Good evening to you, Linda. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Jumoke. Thank you for having me.
Right, so it's been 8 months since President Tinubu became ECOWAS chair. I mean, a lot has happened within the regional body, and at the same time being president of Nigeria. How has the journey been for the president?
Well, thank you, Jumoke. It's been a very eventful 8 months, for President Bola Tinubu as chairman of ECOWAS. But we need to go back to when he was elected as chairman of ECOWAS in July 2023 during the summit of the authorities of heads of state and government in Bissau. And during that summit, after his election, he said he was going to prioritize political stability, peace and security. And that sort of set the tone of how his administration, of how his next few months as ECOWAS chairman was going to be. But he was coming at a time, as ECOWAS chairman, where there was deep uncertainty in the region, particularly political crisis. It was coming at a time of political crisis in the West African sub-region because of problems of terrorism, insecurity, and notably issues of coups and or unconstitutional change in government as seen in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. So these are the problems he had to deal with. They were already there before he came, and he had to deal with as he took over the helms of affairs of ECOWAS. And then, during that summit, the president did, say he was mindful of these problems and promised that ECOWAS under him was going to make concerted efforts to deal with these problems. He also expressed deep concern and worry over what was becoming a trend of coups in the West African sub-region and, fears of it spreading further. He had very strong words about, the trend of unconstitutional change in government and called on the other heads of state and government to defend democracy, But in all this, when he became the chairman of ECOWAS, part of the concerted efforts he did was to deploy, soft diplomacy in trying to reach out to the military administration in these countries to return these countries to constitutional rule, or at least begin the process of returning to constitutional rule. We saw him, deploy some elder statesmen and political and religious leaders, such as the Sultan of Sokoto, former head of state Abdulsalami Abubakar, and Ambassador Babagana Kingibe, as well as other, leaders to go and, mediate on behalf of ECOWAS with the military authorities, particularly in Niger. There were also other back-channel efforts which were deployed, to get to the military junta, to release President Mohamed Bazoum and return the country to democracy. But all this, sort of met a brick wall. The military junta was insistent, on not, returning the country to constitutional rule. And so we saw sanctions, we saw ECOWAS, heads of state and government, issue sanctions on Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, particularly on Niger. Now, one of the things was that, despite these sanctions, which were, issued on these three countries, particularly Niger, humanitarian aid to these countries did not stop despite these sanctions, because ECOWAS has always believed that, despite sanctions on countries under sanctions, humanitarian aid must not stop. And then you have to understand that these countries, and particularly Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, were already dealing with huge humanitarian crises from terrorism, from insecurity, which had caused displacement of people in these countries. We had huge numbers of internally displaced persons, schools shut down, and food insecurity in these countries. And this is where ECOWAS, came in under the leadership of President Bola Tinubu to deal, to offer humanitarian aid to these countries. But it was not very successful, as it was very difficult to get humanitarian aid into a country like Niger. but these efforts are still ongoing. ECOWAS didn't stop in trying to offer humanitarian aid to Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. But unfortunately, these sanctions did not bring about the desired, objectives of getting these countries to return to democracy. And we began to see some Nigerians, some international observers and organizations, notably one of the surviving founding father of ECOWAS, General Gowon. He made a case and he called on the authorities of heads of states to meet and lift the sanctions on Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali on compassionate grounds. And it was at that time too, shortly before this appeal, we saw the three countries decide to exit the regional body ECOWAS and form its own group. So General Gowon asked for, pleaded and called on the heads of state and government to bring these countries back to the fold, lift the sanctions on these three countries, and also asked these countries not to leave the regional body. And so during ECOWAS heads of states and authorities, a summit last month in February, we saw President Tinubu come out to say that there was a need to find another approach in dealing with this problem, as what the approach of sanctions did not yield the desired results, and it called for the lifting of sanctions from these three countries. And then the heads of states of authorities of ECOWAS did in fact lift these sanctions from Niger, but promised that discussions would need to go on between this discussions would need to go on to ensure that these countries return to ECOWAS.
All right, Linda, we'll come back to some of the challenges facing ECOWAS and how the president will continue or will navigate through this geopolitical crisis. But first, as the chairman, what is President Tinubu's vision and mission for ECOWAS?
I think you have to look back to his maiden address when he was elected. He enumerated what his vision would be. Like I said, that he was going to give priority to political stability, peace, and security. And not only that, a defense of democracy. His vision too was also to ensure continued economic development in the West African sub-region. So he was he called for partnerships, international partnerships with the private sector to ensure growth and development in the West African sub-region. And we've seen some of this play out. We've seen ECOWAS, sign agreements, come into agreements with organizations like the EU, like the German government. We saw the Vice Chancellor of German Chancellor visit Nigeria last year, where he met with President Tinubu, to discuss this economic partnerships. And he also met with ECOWAS and the president of ECOWAS, where they both finalized several economic partnerships which they had signed prior in the year. And then we've seen, ECOWAS go into trade partnerships with the EU worth, millions of dollars. Particularly, the EU and ECOWAS signed agreements worth 212 million euros, covering areas such as trade competitiveness, clean energy, migration, clean cooking, and boosting electricity supply, as well as food security. So this is some of the visions and of President Bola Tinubu for ECOWAS.
Right, so in terms of economic integration, growth and development, what strategies has ECOWAS been working on to advance these objectives?
Now, like you said, one of the major objectives of ECOWAS is to encourage growth, economic growth and development in the West African sub-region. It's been one of the major objectives of the regional body. And under it comes, the objective of free movement of goods and services. ECOWAS' aim is to create a common market where people in the sub-region can trade freely across their states. And that's why it introduced its ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Project, which has made the trade in unprocessed goods within West Africa a reality. And so people can take, food items, foodstuffs from one West African country to another West African country without encumbrances like tariffs. ECOWAS is trying to see to the removal of tariffs. This has been an ongoing, an ongoing project over the years, which is something that it keeps on doing. It's still paying attention to remove, encumbrances in tariffs and free flow of goods and services and persons across West African countries. And, President Tinubu has also said, since he became chairman, that he was going to give priority to promoting trade and removing trade barriers, and, call for more partnerships, like I said earlier, with the private sector. There's a lot of effort. He made a lot of emphasis on partnerships with the private sector because he believes that the private sector has an important role to play in ensuring economic growth and development in the West African sub-region.
So still on this, we know that insufficient electricity is a major challenge for the region. Are there any plans, any programs ECOWAS has in place to address this?
Yes, ECOWAS has a very interesting project called the West African Power Pool. Now, this is an ambitious project, so to speak, where ECOWAS has designed this project where West countries under ECOWAS member states can trade in electricity between states. So it's a situation where if a country is deficient in electricity, it can buy electricity from another country that has surplus. So there's trade within ECOWAS member states in electricity. That project is domiciled in Cotonou in Benin Republic. Last year in November, ECOWAS, inaugurated the WAP Information and Coordination Center in Cotonou, and that coordination center is supposed to see to the electricity billing and management of the entire system. And over time, ECOWAS has been trying to link, the electricity supply or electricity apparatus of the different member states, so that they can begin to trade in electricity. And this answers the problem of inadequate electricity in the sub-region. The whole idea is to ensure that there is adequate, clean, and sufficient as well as stable electricity, among member countries.
But in the area of infrastructure, what has the regional body been working on to aid physical integration of member states?
One of the projects, and it's quite a very interesting project that has been nurtured for some time and discussed, is the Lagos-Abidjan highway corridor. It's an ambitious project which is expected to link 5 ECOWAS member states. And so it's a highway project, which has different components, even linking the coastal areas. And so this project is supposed to ensure physical integration, ensure that, residents, citizens of ECOWAS member states can move, freely and safely among member states. In the process, engendering economic integration and, transfer or ferrying of goods and goods particularly among member countries. So this is an ambitious project which ECOWAS has been working on, and progress is being made in this regard.
More member states will be conducting elections this year. What assistance will ECOWAS be rendering towards credible and peaceful elections in these states? And how is ECOWAS working to ensure democracy across the region?
Now, that without peace and security, you can't have, democracy. And one of the ways ECOWAS is really, really insistent that its member states abide by the protocols of ECOWAS, committing to peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another. And we saw, President Bola Tinubu during his maiden address when he was elected, calling on heads of authorities of member states to defend democracy. And we've seen, before we get to the issues of elections, we've seen ECOWAS under the chairmanship of President Bola Tinubu, intervene or sort of make a stand as regards a bit of political crisis we've been seeing in the last few months in Senegal. And we saw ECOWAS ask the Senegalese political stakeholders in Senegal to abide by their constitution. And so ECOWAS is also interested in institutions, in building institutions and ensuring that institutions have the capacity to defend governance and so to defend democracy. And so we saw a situation in Senegal where the Constitutional Court did come up to say that, uphold the Constitution, the Constitutional Court coming up to say that elections should hold in Senegal before the expiration of the tenure of the Senegalese president. And then thankfully, the Senegalese president has fixed, elections for March 24th. So this came about because of, strong institutions which are critical in democracy, as well as the resilience of Senegalese people and also, civil society organizations, which ECOWAS is also interested and has been trying to build their capacity. Now, in the areas of elections, ECOWAS renders support to countries in transition in elections, and ECOWAS has over time and offered technical support to member states during elections, technical support such as cleaning up election registers, logistic supports, training of ad hoc staff, training of civil society or members of civil society organizations, and also a lot of behind the scenes activities, particularly in member states in crisis because of elections. There's a lot of behind the scenes engagements with political actors in those countries to sort of like maintain peace and ensure that elections, are conducted transparently and freely. And also ECOWAS, we've also seen ECOWAS also, give financial support to some countries during elections. So it's doing a whole lot to maintain peace and democracy and credible elections in the West African sub-region.
Right. So let's go back to the recent crisis within the region, and that's the withdrawal of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso from ECOWAS. Recently, the sanctions on Niger and others have been lifted. There are those who have said ECOWAS regretted its actions, hence this decision. But then what's the latest on this development?
Okay, so it's, I think the lifting of, we have to remember that these sanctions, what they were called for, these sanctions, ECOWAS did not issue these sanctions to make life worse for the people of these countries. It's been this misconception, And one of the reasons why it lifted these sanctions, because the regional body saw that these sanctions were having a very huge effect on the ordinary citizens. It was causing, these countries are already struggling, and you have humanitarian crisis already in these countries, and it wasn't giving the desired effect. And that's why President Bola Tinubu called on ECOWAS to lift the sanctions, and the authorities of heads of state did in fact listen to people calling for the lifting of these sanctions. So right now what is going is, consultations, the ECOWAS is open because these countries have signified interest in leaving ECOWAS, but the protocol of ECOWAS says it has to be under 1 year. So there's a 1 year window for discussions and talks to take place, and ECOWAS is really, really desirous of these countries to return to ECOWAS because it has said over and over again that unity, all the countries unified, will make greater impact and give them, the capabilities to deal with this myriad of problems facing the West African sub-region. There are enough problems facing, member states, problems of economic challenges, terrorism, security challenges. And so there is a need for all the member states to come together in unity to address this problem. So we are going to see, hopefully we're going to see lots of negotiations and mediations and backdoor talks, to try to bring these member states back to the fold.
But can you categorically say that whether or not their withdrawal had any repercussion on the stability of the region?
Well, definitely. Their withdrawal had, repercussions in terms of ECOWAS has, projects in these countries. And so what is going to happen to those projects in these countries? And then you also know that these countries, if they leave, it would also mean that free movement would no longer happen anymore, because right now citizens from these countries in the West African sub-region can travel unhindered, well, with their ECOWAS passports or their ID cards from one country to another. So this is not going to, I don't think this is going to continue if these countries eventually leave. And there's a lot of aid going to these countries, a lot of programs, EBID, ECOWAS Bank of Development has projects in these countries. What would happen to the projects in these countries? What would happen to, just projects that have been on over the years in this country? What would be the future of these projects? And then you have to realize that, particularly for a country like Niger and Nigeria, we are brothers. We have a long-standing familiar relationship with this country. And so it's going to be really, really be difficult. And also, even in fighting terrorism, we share a border particularly with Niger. How would the fight against terrorism be? And so this is a very, very difficult time, and it needs all hands on deck to make sure that proper discussions are had to make sure that these countries come back to the fold.
Right. I mean, because Niger and Mali said their needs were not adequately met as members of ECOWAS, I mean, a lot of persons have been asking, what exactly are the benefits of being a member of ECOWAS? And since declaring their independence, ECOWAS has been trying to woo Niger and Mali back into the body. Do you see them coming back?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. But it's when they said that ECOWAS, I would say that ECOWAS actually has rendered assistance to these countries to deal with terrorism. It has sent funds to these countries prior to when the sanctions were held. So, ECOWAS has tried to deal with this, the problems of terrorism and insecurity. Should they have done more? Certainly, and I'm sure ECOWAS also has its lessons that it has learned, or it will learn from this impasse between these countries. But we hope, at this point, that it come back to the community.
Right, but these sanctions that were lifted were meant to serve as deterrents to soldiers in other countries in the sub-region. If sanctions look like it's not working, what other measures are in place for future occurrences like this?
Now, it's very interesting because, when we talk about these sanctions, we have to remember that all the 15 member states, they signed an agreement, an agreement on good governance and democracy. So these sanctions were not coming out of the blues. Every single member state signed the agreements, and the protocols, to ensure good governance and democracy. And so, it's rather difficult, for what is happening right now between ECOWAS and these member states. But the hope is that, this would also serve as a deterrent to other member states, because if you, like I said earlier, these countries, these member states who have left ECOWAS are not any more peaceful or secure since they left ECOWAS. They're still dealing with issues of insecurity, and it's worse. It has worsened right now, because when you have a country that is plagued by insecurity and terrorism, and the military in that country takes over, the attention is divided, because they can't give all the attention to fighting terrorism and protecting the territorial integrity of that country. They also now have to deal with governance issues, and so the attention is divided. And so that's why we have seen that security has been worsened, has spiked in these member countries. There's some statistics. If you want to look at some statistics that have come out from these countries, we've seen huge displacement. Schools remained closed in these countries. Another worrying statistics we've seen since last year is that Burkina Faso also accounts for about 2 million displaced persons, while Mali and Niger each have close to 500,000 displaced persons. So like I said, these countries are not any more secure now than before, before they left, before the military took over. So this may, be a deterrent to some of these countries who want to leave, who might want to leave in the future.
I get that. Right, I get that. But there are diplomats, there are stakeholders and security experts who are bothered that the powerlessness of these sanctions might embolden other coup plotters in the West African sub-region. Are you bothered as well?
Well, of course we are bothered, but we want to hope that we want to hope and believe in institutions, the institutions in these countries will not allow that happen, and that we are hoping that democracy would have a foothold or has a foothold in these countries to see that the alternatives to the democracy just doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And so we hope that, this doesn't, arise again in these countries.
I agree with those who are saying ECOWAS needs to reinvent itself, especially when it comes to maintaining hardline positions.
I think the question I would ask is, do hardline positions work? I'm going to throw that question back to you. Do hardline positions work? Have we seen it work in the past?
I should be asking you, have these sanctions worked in the past?
We haven't seen, well, recently, in the most recent, we haven't seen it work. And so I know President Tinubu, this is why he said ECOWAS needs to look at other ways, of handling this crisis, look at other solutions. And this is something that the heads of state and government and the authorities of heads of state and government and the institution will need to sit down and think about very critically, since we have seen that these hardline positions, particularly like sanctions, in this case, in this instance, did not work, and instead, made things worse for the people of these countries.
But also, when it comes to ECOWAS' pursuit of counterterrorism measures, what are the challenges undermining a cohesive regional effort?
Now, before we talk about the challenges, ECOWAS does in fact have, several counter-terrorism measures. It has the Multinational Joint Task Force, it has the Accra Declaration, the Accra Initiative, and it's also trying to ensure that its standby force, now begins to help in the fight against terrorism. This is something that is being discussed. ECOWAS is looking at the modalities for making sure the standby force is properly equipped financially and has all it takes, to go into counter-terrorism and security in the sub-region. So instead of looking at the challenges right now, ECOWAS is looking at the solutions to security and insecurity and terrorism. And then we also, if you cast your mind back, we also saw, President Tinubu calling for a harmonization and proper coordination of all these, anti-terrorism activities and projects and programs to make them more efficient in tackling insecurity and terrorism in the West African sub-region.
Because many other nations see us as the big brother, and now President Tinubu, our own president, is the chairman of ECOWAS, what is the president doing to strengthen democracy in West Africa, especially in coup-prone countries?
Building institutions under ECOWAS. You can't run away from building strong institutions. If you have strong institutions, even if you have a scenario where you have, a head of state or, a president who wants to circumvent or perpetuate itself in power, strong institutions would always save the country at the end of the day. So one of his priorities is on defense of democracy through building strong institutions in these countries. And then there are talks about ECOWAS putting together protocols to ensure that, people do not, presidents or heads of state do not perpetuate themselves in power. So it's a conversation that is going on, but emphasis really is on strong institutions and active populace and active civil society in these countries.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I've been speaking with the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Strategic Communications, Linda Ahiwe. Thank you so much for joining us as we focus on the 8 months of President Tinubu's leadership in Economic Community of West African States. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.